So at this point, this is probably one of those things that you would pick out and think he's playing maybe some outside notes or something like that. But it's really pretty much standard blues stuff, thrown in one or two little notes that might be a little foreign to you. But anyway, let's start. And again, this starts after that, going down those 6 intervals. So he slides up from the 6th fret of the B string to the 7th fret of the B string. And then he goes to that A note on the E string, 5th fret. So you have. And he does this little trill from the 5th fret to the 7th fret back to the 5th fret on the B string. And then he goes to the D note on the 7th fret of the G string. So that whole thing is. Then he goes back to the 5th fret of the B string, rolls back over to the 5th fret of the G string, and then he slides down a half step to the B note, the 4th fret of the G string. Right? So that whole phrase is. Then he just continues down the scale, skipping, well, if you think of this part as being like the pentatonic scale, he goes from the 7th fret to the 5th fret of the D string to the 7th fret of the A string. So you have that. Right? And again, if you look at this, this is all, besides that first slid note and that second note, it's all pentatonic stuff. Right? And except for that one other slide note. That note right there is the 9th, but other than that, it's all pentatonic stuff, with the exception of, and again, we'll get into this later, that 6th, the major 6th, and that 9th. And then there's that major 6th again at that phrase. So anyway, the whole lick again goes like this. Then he repeats that little trill that he did here, but on the D string. So he goes from the 5th fret to the 7th fret, back to the 5th fret. That's a hammer on and pull off. And then he goes down, he slides down a half step to the 4th fret of the A, all on the D string, I'm sorry. So the whole thing is. And then he resolves finally on that D note on the A string 5th fret. Now again, I said that was the major 6th and the 9th there, and then going back to the 6th there too. Now that's thinking of it in the key of A, basing it off of some kind of A scale. But that whole section was actually being played over the D chord. So that first note that he slides into, again, we'll go back to this later, is sliding into that major 3rd. And when he goes down to that note, that is, instead of being the 9th, it's the 6th of D. Again, a little sidetrack, we'll go back into that later. So the whole phrase is, and watch out for the dynamics there too, because again, he picks this first note a little bit harder, and he kind of lightens up all the way until he gets down to that note there. So, and then when he hits this little trill, he hits that a little harder. And when he climbs up this scale part, again, it's a little lighter. And then when he gets to that diminished part, he kind of picks it a little harder. So let's get into what he does after that phrase. So when he's on that D note of the A string, he walks up basically an arpeggio, a D7 arpeggio. So he goes to the 4th fret of the D string to the 7th fret of the D string to the 5th fret of the G string to the 7th fret of the G string. And that's just your root, major 3rd, 5th, flat 7, root, which is just your dominant D, dominant 7 arpeggio. Then he gets into this diminished thing where he slides up from the 7th, he hits the 7th fret again, slides up a half step to the 8th fret, and then just walks up a diminished arpeggio. which is from the 8th fret of the G string to the 7th fret of the B string to the 5th fret of the E string to the 8th fret of the E string. So that whole phrase is. Then he just does some intervals where he does the 7th fret and 7th fret on both the E string, then the B string, then he does the 5th fret on both the E string, then the B string. So that whole thing is. Then he just slides from the 8th fret of the B string up to the 10th fret, back down to the 8th fret. And he goes to the 5th fret of that, all on the B string. So that whole thing is. And once he gets to that 5th fret of the B string, he kind of goes up around the 9th or 10th fret, and he slides on the G string down to the 7th fret. So, and he scrapes the E and B string first. So, but you don't really hear a definitive note. It's, it's kind of in there somewhere. So that whole thing is. And then he pulls off from the 7th fret that he just landed on the G string to the 5th fret of the G string. And he kind of bends that up. He does this a lot with that minor major third thing. He bends it up, but he doesn't reach the major third. So the 5th fret, he kind of bends up just like a quarter step. So you have. Then he goes back to the 7th fret of the G string to the 5th fret of the B string. So the whole thing is. So after he gets to that 5th fret of the B string, he rolls his finger down to the 5th fret of the G string, and again bends that up just slightly. Then he plays the 7th fret of the G string to the 7th fret of the D string. So the whole thing is. So he mutes all these strings except for the A string, which is his third finger is on the 7th fret, and he slides down from the 7th fret to the 5th fret, just like he did before. Then he does that thing again where he trills from the 6th, 5, and pulls off to the 3rd, all on the A string. So you have. But this time he ends with the 5th fret of the E string, and then resolves to that D note, the 5th fret of the A string. So the whole thing is. Then he gets into this little chordal thing where he plays the 4th fret of the D string. Then he plays the 3rd fret of the B string to the 5th fret of the G string. Then he slides up from the 5th fret of the D string to the 7th fret of the D string. So you have. And now when he does this too, if you notice, he does that scrape thing. And it's kind of back here a little bit with the pick. And when he plays those two notes, especially that D note on the 5th fret of the A string, he's playing it really close to this bridge to get that tinny sound. So you have. Then he comes back with the pick up around here a little bit more to get a softer, mellower sound. And he gets all those notes to ring together. Then he slides up to that 7th fret. Then Then he just does this little pivot thing from the 5th fret of the D string to the 7th fret of the A string, back to the 5th fret of the D string. And he bends that up just a little bit, a little quarter step, so you have. Then the last 2 notes are that 7th fret of the A string and the open E string, and both those notes are played again with the pick closer to the bridge here, as opposed to. All right, so that whole thing is. And then he slides into these 2 chords where same shape, but it's the 8th fret of the G string with your 3rd finger, then your 2nd finger's on the 7th fret of the B string, and then your pinkies on the 8th fret of the E string. And then it slides up a half step. So now your 8th fret, 3rd finger slides up to the 9th fret, and the whole shape just slides up a half step. Now, again, we'll get back into this later, but those are 2 different chords, even though they just look like the same shape, but they're suggesting 2 different chords. And so after he slides into that, and again, this is where he kind of does things with his pick. He strums that with his 1st finger, so he's hiding the pick away somewhere, and he goes, just to get a little bit lighter tone as opposed to. You could hear that softness, right? So that whole thing, one more time, is. So after those chords, he slides kind of from nowhere again on the G string down to the 7th fret of the G string. And he again scrapes the E and the B string. So you start around the 9th fret or so and slide down. And he goes from the 7th fret pulling off to the 5th fret of the G string. And again, he bends up like just a quarter step. Then he goes back to the 7th fret of the G string, to the 5th fret of the B string, down to the 7th fret of the G string, and he kind of holds that note for a second. Then he goes from the 7th fret of the G string to the 7th fret of the D string. So that whole thing slow is. Then he kind of slams on from barring the 5th fret on both the D and the G string to the G string 6th fret. So you have, and you get that A dominant sound. So you have. And after he gets to that chord, he just raises that 6th fret to the 7th fret on the G string while still holding the 5th fret of the D string. So you went from. And then he just plays that D9 chord. So that whole thing is. And he goes back into that riff that we started at the beginning, sliding up to the 9th fret of the A string, going to the 7th fret of the D string, back down to the 9th fret of the A string, to the 10th fret of the D string. So you have. But this time, instead of doing the phrase exactly the way he did before, he goes. He pivots again off the 7th fret of the G string to the 10th fret of the D string. So you have. he slides up again from that 8th fret to 9th fret on the G string, but he sits on that 10th fret of the B string. So you have, and then he just pulls off without picking to that 8th fret of the B string, and he does it in kind of a harsh, abrupt way, and he stops it. So you have,